Hi, I'm Dr. Sunny Ravencourt from the University of Coruscant, and when I can't find reliable information for a lecture,
I steal it from the Jedi Temple Archive Podcast.
Seriously, I do. Their security is terrible. There's like one old lady running the whole place.
Hey, Star Wars fans, this is Ro from the ever-imperial, always sunny Scarif Podcast. Recently, it's come to our attention that there's been a security leak here on Scarif Station. I call on all our Imperial agents to be vigilant and to scan the HoloNet for news and rebel rumblings. I call upon you to access the Jedi Temple Archives podcast for the latest in Star Wars.
Welcome to part 2 of our special mega crossover episode with the Scarif Podcast and episode 43 of the Jedi Temple Archives podcast.
There is more knowledge here than anywhere else in the galaxy. Only members of the Jedi Council are allowed access. Guarding the holocrons is one of the most important duties a Jedi can be given. Do you think you're up to the task?
Welcome to another episode of the Jedi Temple Archives podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and we are recording this episode on Monday, February 10th, 2020. Today, we're going to be continuing the conversation that we started on the Scarif podcast earlier this week as part of our mega crossover episode with Ro and Alex from the Scarif podcast, and I'm going to have them on shortly. If you have not listened to the first part of that chat, definitely go over to Scarif Podcast and check that out. You can download them pretty much anywhere you get podcasts, and you're definitely going to want to listen to that first portion of the podcast just so you can kind of be up to speed on where we left off there, and we pick it up pretty quickly here. But before we get to that, I do want to just take a couple quick moments to kind of go over the HoloNet news, because the chat that we do as part of that crossover episode basically feeds right into our outro, so it definitely makes sense to do it here. But I also want to point out that we do have a February giveaway going, and that is out on social media. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter is where I have it posted. We should have it out on our Pinterest as well at JTA Podcast on all those social networks. It is for a Jyn Erso and Cassian Andor set of Black Series characters, so if you are interested in that, please go check out that post. I will try to bump it up, and all you need to do is just kind of follow the instructions there to get an entry, and I will be picking that winner on February 28th, so I should have that announced there or shortly thereafter. And really the major news story for this week is that Disney has announced that they are going to be taking reservations for the Galactic Star Cruiser Hotel, which is that kind of custom boutique hotel that's going to be located over by Hollywood Studios. And it's going to be really a unique experience for hotel guests at the Walt Disney World Resort. It's going to be sort of an all-inclusive, at least that's the expectation. You're going to be able to kind of live your Star Wars dream. You're going to be given a persona when you check in. Again, it's very exclusive. I believe they said it's something on the level of about 68 rooms or thereabouts, but it's really going to be kind of formatted more like a cruise. It's going to be 2 nights, 3 days. You'll have special access to Star Wars Galaxy's Edge via a shuttle, and it's going to be, I'm sure, pricey, so you're going to be encouraged to take advantage of the things going on there in the hotel. And the other major story for this week is that we are about a week away, or exactly a week away as of the date of recording for this episode, for the 7th season and final season of the Clone Wars. So if you have not finished your rewatch of the Clone Wars, or if you've not seen it prior to now, you may want to start binging that on Disney Plus. It is 6 seasons, so it's going to be a tough binge in the next week, but certainly worth it to kind of get the backstory that is laid out there. And I really think that a lot of the fans that were really tied into the story that was going on there within the Clone Wars are going to be very excited to kind of see how that gets wrapped up within this series. And certainly the animation that we have seen so far looks amazing. So I know I'm personally ready to watch it the day it comes out, and looking forward to hearing what your thoughts and hopes are for it. So if you want to drop us a line on our voicemail or shoot us an email, that voicemail number is 201-746-5827, which is JTAP. So drop us a line, let us know what you think, and looking forward to hearing what your thoughts are once that has aired.
Congratulations, you are being rescued. Please do not resist.
All right, so we are back, and this week we are continuing the mega crossover event that we started over on Scarif Podcast earlier this week. So if you have not already listened to that episode, please go and check it out. But I am joined here today by the host of the Scarif Scuttlebutt Podcast, Ro, and his co-host, Alex from Imperial Entanglements. Guys, thank you so much for joining me here on the Jedi Temple Archives Podcast.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Well, did I have a choice? I mean, it was mega crossover, right?
Yeah, mega crossover. How's everybody doing at the Jedi Temple Archives?
We cannot complain. Tom's been a busy man, so it's been helpful having a couple other podcasts I could do some episodes with. We're going to be getting him back here in the not too distant future. But, we really had a great conversation that got started over there on the Scarif Podcast regarding fan service, the other four-letter word. And I would certainly say that is an appropriate title for kind of how fan service is viewed in this day and age. And specifically, we talked about it a little bit over on your show, but the Rogue One film that came out a few years ago, which was always kind of listed as a love letter to the fans, there are fans that feel like that whole thing is just pure fan service and not really in service to any greater story. But clearly you guys have an attachment to that in the sense that you kind of themed your entire podcast around that. So what was your, kind of viewpoint, I guess, on the Rogue One storyline?
Rogue One was fantastic. I loved seeing how the Rebels, obtained the secret plans of the Death Star. I loved all the characters. I loved the throwbacks. I loved the fan service that is Rogue One. Like you said, it's a love letter to Star Wars fans. And I am all in. Alex had mentioned something in our podcast earlier on our show. Rogue One is one of those things that it really does feel, although it's a new film from Disney, Star Wars, it does have that feeling like it was done back in 1977. That it was released in 1977, from the set pieces, from the characters, from the sideburns that the X-Wing pilots had. It was just a really 100% complete product of pleasing the fans in a good way. And, when I had posted that initial post about fan service, there were one or two followers of ours that kind of gave us a little pushback, thinking that we were using that, term in a bad way, and far from the truth, because, like I said, Rogue One and fan service is a great thing, because I've always said, if you're not doing a film, especially a Star Wars, for the fans, then what the hell are you doing?
Alex, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm pretty much in complete agreement with Ro on that. I think aesthetically, Rogue One really fit the bill for me. I missed that old school original trilogy feel in the new era of Disney Star Wars, and Rogue One really gave me what I wanted out of that. And again, you guys were talking about on the other podcast on the first episode about the diversity of the cast. You don't see that as a thing until you really think about it. But that cast, you had Donnie Yen and Cassian Andor actor. I can't remember what you guys already told me. Diego Luna. You had all these great cast members, all these characters that were fantastic and fit into the universe. And I want to kind of push back on the whole, like, it's not really in service of any greater story. I kind of disagree with that. I think knowing where we got those plans, having that, that line in the opening crawl of A New Hope, kind of given a full story. we kind of know the outcome, but we got attached. At least I did. I got attached to those characters fairly quickly in that movie, and it felt great to watch them go through this adventure together. And it was heartbreaking to watch what happened to them at the end. And I felt like their sacrifice is what fed into the original trilogy and into A New Hope. And as we catch up with that story a couple minutes later, when Leia's, getting the plans with R2, like, it felt so cohesive with the entire story that I don't see it as kind of like a pointless, fan service drivel. It felt very real to me. It felt like it fit into the story, and it deserved to be there, in my opinion. So everything about that movie, minus the Borg gullet, is probably fantastic. I could take or leave the Borg gullet.
Borg gullet can feel your thoughts. No lie is safe. What have you really brought me, cargo pilot? Borg gullet will know the truth. The unfortunate side effect is that one tends to lose one's mind.
I love that movie. It's so much fun to watch. It's got a great feel to it. It's got a great message too. I want to remind people of that, like that friendship message where these people were almost enemies at the beginning of the movie, and then by the end they had all come together to work as a team, and it just worked out so well. So I think it really did encapsulate the heart of Star Wars for me, and the fan service was just the icing on the cake. Having Gold Leader and all the other squad members come back at the very end for the Scarif battle. I mean, I almost stood up in my chair and cheered, man. That was such a great moment, and it fit so well. It wasn't out of place. It didn't take you out of the movie. It was like, yeah, of course they would be there. They're the leaders of the rebellion, they're the squad. So it felt great, man. I love that movie. It's such a great feel good moment.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those moments where, you want to get up in your chair and cheer. And I'm sure people around you would be like, what is this guy doing? But it is one of those deep cuts where you realize, oh, my God, this is the actor. And they brought him back to do some additional, voice recording to make it fit into this film. And, that talk about fan service behind the scenes. I mean, that is a labor of love, if you ask me.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think it's interesting. One of the things that we talked a little bit about on Scarif when we were recording the first portion of this episode was that, Ro, you had shared an article with Alex and I about defining fan service in the age of Endgames, an article out on Film School Rejects by Hayden Kamel. And interestingly enough, in that article, while they're talking about the fact that in a lot of ways fan service can be a good thing, kind of the only negative portion that they had in that story was talking about Rogue One, which they considered to have kind of some cheap walk-on cameos from background characters from A New Hope, and then some bizarre CGI resurrections of people like, Grand Moff Tarkin. So, the interesting thing to me is that the cameo from Dr. Evazan and Ponda Baba on Jedha aside, I don't really feel like resurrecting Tarkin's character within that particular film was in any way, shape, or form a bad thing. He seemed to be very much a good fit for the story they were telling. It's more character development really for Tarkin than you get even within A New Hope. I mean, we only get a very brief exposure to him, but he's clearly a very driven individual who is very adept at political maneuvering. He's basically holding Vader's leash within the story of A New Hope, which is no small feat. So when they sit there and say that, these are just brought back and they don't really have any bearing on the story, I would strongly disagree with that. I think that Tarkin's character especially, not only was he well portrayed with the CGI work that they did in that film, but it was very much a critical portion of that story.
You can't have a film like Rogue One without the character of Grand Moff Tarkin. And you're right, he was a genius Imperial officer. I think he is the first Imperial to hold that title, Grand Moff. There were no other Grand Moffs before him. I think he broke the mold, and a great job from a technical aspect too. It was really great to see.
Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with this bringing back past actors with the use of CGI. I'm not really a big fan of the idea of it, although I think it was executed well in Rogue One. The actor that actually played the part behind the scenes without the CGI mask on looked a lot like Peter Cushing.
Yeah.
He actually looked physically a lot like him. I think if they would have maybe used some makeup a little bit, they actually could have just used him as an actor, because he did the voice and everything, and I think he just did a fantastic job. So in my opinion, and I don't know if this has anything to do with fan service or not, but in my opinion, I think recasting that part with an actor and making them look that way as much as possible, using practical makeup and maybe some digital effects here and there, but not, I don't know, I'm kind of on the fence about the recreating somebody else and kind of like sticking their face on another actor. Not a big fan of that idea. But I agree with you guys 100%. It would have been impossible to tell the story of Rogue One with the creation of the Death Star, and it's without Tarkin. Like, that's his baby. You know, we see him on the Death Star. That's his flagship almost. Like, that's where he belongs. So to have the creation of it, or at least the last steps of its creation, be absent, I think would have been more
conspicuous.
Yeah, it would have been worse for him not to be there. It would have been like, well, where the heck was Tarkin during all of this?
Right.
Like, if he wasn't there, it doesn't make any sense not to have him. So I'm 100% for that. I loved having him back and seeing him on screen and watching him do his thing.
And getting back to what George Lucas has said in the past, Star Wars was always, at least for him, a vehicle to push technology forward, and the creation of digital Grand Moff Tarkin certainly did that. And I think it will pave the way for future endeavors digitally and creatively. I'm not against recreating actors in that way as much as it seems like you are, Alex. I think I'm not gonna sit here and say that, hey, let's recreate everybody, but when it's done well, I think when it serves that purpose, I think Rogue One is definitely a good example of why they needed to do something like this.
I was going to say it's very specific to Star Wars because it's a franchise that's 40 years old. You have this character that's beloved by fans, and 40 years later, you're trying to put this character back on screen. That makes sense. But when it comes to films, I think I heard a rumor that Hollywood was thinking about doing a film with James Dean.
Right.
And I'm like, why?
Yeah.
He's been gone for a very long time. And to have some actor portray his bodily movements and maybe his voice, but then paste a digital face on top of it just seems so off. Like, why not just recast somebody who kind of looks like him?
At that point, it seems gimmicky.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a fine line to be played. I think Rogue One kind of fares on the side of being okay. Although, again, I wouldn't have been opposed to having an actor as skilled as the one who did the voice have played the whole part. It wouldn't have bothered me. I think it would have been a fine thing for them to do. But again, you make a good point about George and his technology. He loves his toys, man. I can't argue with that. He was the one who pushed digital technology forward in the 70s and again in the 90s and 2000s with the prequels. So it seems to be continuing that legacy.
Yeah, I would say that, you look at some of the things that Star Wars does that really aren't done anywhere else. And this whole concept of a film franchise that spans 43 years, that has started in the middle, had to go back to the beginning and then jump ahead into the future, isn't really something we've seen done anywhere else. I mean, you've got Star Trek films that were made in the past, and really what they've done in the future is kind of a reboot of the franchise. But Star Wars in this 9-film arc has very much been kind of a storytelling of one entire story. You look at potentially like a Ewan McGregor within the prequels, right? He clearly went out of his way to adopt the look to the greatest extent he could, and the mannerisms and the speech patterns of Alec Guinness, who had portrayed Obi-Wan so well in the original trilogy. And you could probably even look at something like that and say, is that fan servicey, or is that just him respecting the original work that Alec Guinness had done? And he just wanted to make sure that he was portraying that character as truthfully as he possibly could.
And, you just said something, and Alex said it in the last episode, when it's done right, if it serves the purpose in the story, I think there is a fine line. Obviously now with social media, everybody's jumping on the bandwagon and using the term fan service in a derogatory way. But, obviously we've discussed it. I mean, there's definitely methods to the madness. There's methods to be able to bring back, callbacks. A lot of people use fan service as a bad term. They'll switch it around and say it's a callback, just to kind of soften the blow, I feel sometimes. Like I mentioned when I posted this talk about fan service, I got a little pushback and like, no, fan service is good. I'm like, no, I know, I love fan service. I'm a fan. But it is a very interesting topic. I think even when I was on an episode of Radio Misfits, Star Wars episode, I was on with Jimmy Mack from Rebel Force Radio, and I just kind of mentioned the term fan service, and he's like, "Whoa, no, fan service. Why do you?" I'm like, "No, like I said, I love fan service. I just said it because I know, you know what it means, but I'm not using it in a derogatory way. I'm a fan, and I love to see these callbacks. So it is a very interesting thing. It's a polarizing thing, as anything in Star Wars lately, but. Yeah, you gotta love it. You gotta love it.
Well, and it's kind of sad that it's become that way, right? Because ultimately, it's about storytelling. It's about kind of detaching from reality and stepping into this galaxy far, far away and really enjoying yourself. And when the fans do that and they just kind of let themselves go and live in this world that was created, so amazingly by George Lucas with the original trilogy, you kind of can just sit back and enjoy it, and you don't have to worry about the fan service aspect. I feel like the fan service, calling things fan service and really getting into that argument is a way to kind of express maybe some angst that they have about other things within the overall storytelling. And we talked about it a little bit on the Scarif Podcast about, Alex, you were saying that you don't even like to address the Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker because that kind of is just one ball of controversy, I guess, that has been created. Prior to that, leading up to Force Awakens, it was talked about really within Force Awakens that was in some ways derivative of A New Hope. But again, they were trying to relaunch the franchise after a break. I didn't really have so much an issue with that. But I wonder how much of this is really people having an issue with fan service and how much of it is really people expressing a deeper issue they have with the fact that there wasn't a real clear direction for the sequel trilogy, and that was evidenced in those final two films.
Yeah, just thinking back to The Force Awakens, I'm trying to think of what may have been a little bit over the top fan service. Definitely Starkiller Base, I think, as kind of like a stand-in for a Death Star. That could be a little heavy-handed, fan servicey, kind of like it's a callback to A New Hope, but amped up to 11 for some reason. Yeah. And we've already seen, this planet-destroying ball 2 other times before. So there's definite moments, and there's criticisms about the sequel trilogy and the prequels for that matter that are legit. This fan service, I don't know, man. It's a tough subject because being somebody who doesn't get bothered by that very much. Although when somebody points it out to me and says, see, doesn't that seem weird? I'm like, well, yeah, it kind of does, I guess. Like, why are the First Order just upgraded stormtroopers? Why don't they have different uniforms? And I'm like, well, it's because they wanted to call back to the Emperor or the Empire. It's fan service. Like, okay, I get what you're saying. So you have to, I'm trying to look at it from a different perspective now that we're talking about it a little bit more. If you're of that mentality that you're like, hey, I want fresh new ideas. I don't want just rehashed things. I don't want the same, I don't want to see just upgraded AT-AT walkers in The Last Jedi on a white planet that's not really snow, but it looks like snow. It's like there's a fan servicey moments that you could definitely look at in a negative light, and they're riddled all over the sequel trilogy. But it's hard. These modern day filmmakers who are in charge of Lucasfilm and who are given the chance to make a Star Wars film, they're all like us. They grew up with Star Wars. They love all of it. So they want to put these moments in there as much for themselves as for all the fans. Like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we could see like a new type of AT-AT walker? Like, let's do that scene, and then we'll have a new planet that's like kind of white but it has like this red underlying crystal. I'm like, I say it that way, it sounds pretty cool. So there's this dueling thing that you can definitely see two different sides of the argument.
It's interesting though, because you never see anyone complain about the fact that Iron Man has 42 versions of his armor, right?
Right.
But the stormtroopers change their armor, God forbid, right?
Yeah. Oh, dude, I loved it when people were mad about the Sith troopers. Like, it's just a red stormtrooper. I'm like,
I was going to mention that. Yeah. I was going to say when people, and then when the filmmakers do change something, and then you've got stormtroopers riding on this bike that flips one of them to the back, and that's like totally new. They can fly now. They're like, no, man, that's just to sell toys. I'm like, all right, I give up.
That was kind of goofy though, man. Like, why
Star Wars has been about selling toys.
Oh yeah,
since the original trilogy. Right?
Yeah, that's true. George, that was George's bread and butter, man. Selling toys was how he made the original trilogy happen. So
I think it's still his bread and butter.
Yeah.
But
that is a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
I think that we should have at some point, because I think it is incredible. I don't think a lot of people understand how many places the original trilogy could have failed, stalled, and never occurred.
Sure.
The more I read of the making books, it's a minor miracle that original trilogy Star Wars was ever actually a thing.
Oh, that first. The original Star Wars movie, it was saved. I think they said it was saved in the editing bay. Like, it was an awful movie. If you watch the unedited, just behind the scenes cuts of the scenes, where like Darth Vader's helmet's falling off, and like Chewbacca just looks awful at a certain angle, and this and that. But George, worked his magic in the editing bay and made it happen.
It was George and Marsha Lucas. Marsha was the one that saved it in the edit. I'd love to go back in time and just be on the set. Hi, little Padawan.
What am I doing? I'm doing a podcast.
We're talking Star Wars.
My lightsabers. Do you want one of those?
Yeah. So, I'd love to go back in time and just kind of fly in the wall and watch the filmmakers do their thing and see how truly horrible of an experience it was. And, George Lucas always talked about how bad that directing experience was. None of the crew wanted to go into overtime. They were losing light or whatever, and the crews would be like, no, it's 5 o'clock, time to quit. And he had such a rough time with the crews in England. So, but yeah, here we are 40 plus years later, we're still talking about it.
And that, that's the thing. It's the legacy. Everybody wants to call back to that original time because it was such a magical thing that those movies even made it. And then on top of that, how much of a phenomenon they were. So people are constantly looking for ways to be like, hey, I'm a fan, I want to do like a little nod to George or this or that. And that's where fan service stems from. I don't think it ever stems from like a negative place. It's always somebody who just wants to do a little, thank you to George, and hey, I remember this scene particularly because of this, so I kind of want to make something that resembles it. And they do that in their own movies. And J.J. Abrams is very keen on what fans like. I think you can see that through his Star Trek movies. There was a lot of callbacks in those movies that were for the original Star Trek TV show. And, I think there was a Tribble in there somewhere. Like, that was a fan service moment to have the Tribble show up in the Star Trek movie. It's not, I don't know. It always puts a smile on my face. He's just talking about it. It makes me smile. So I find it hard to criticize fan service. I love it.
In the long run, fan service is good. I don't, I don't hold a grudge against fan service. Obviously there are, eye-rolling moments and like, it's like, oh, ha, okay, I get it. But, especially with a franchise as old as Star Wars, I mean, it's really hard not to spot something that's fan servicey per se, because it's occurring in the same galaxy. It's occurring in the same universe that we're all familiar with. And if you recognize something, and then obviously right away it's going to be claimed as, oh, look, it's fan servicey. So, okay, that's fine. That's your opinion, but it's hard to avoid. And you're right, Alex. I think fan service, stems from a good place almost like you're giving credit to something that you love and you want to try to emulate it. I think it's a good thing overall.
And there's a bigger component with Star Wars, right? Because the one thing that every time a director takes on a project that is Star Wars related, their main concern is not just telling the story, but making sure it feels like Star Wars. So how many of these things are fan service for the sake of fan service, and how many of them are components that put the fan base in that mindset that, hey, this is Star Wars? Watching The Mandalorian, we talked about the fact that when you deal with the original, the Star Wars Skywalker saga, the 9-film arc, that is the only thing that has really taken place over the course of this 42, 43 years. The more recent things, especially that are disconnected from that have had a more kind of universal acceptance, something like a Rogue One, something like The Mandalorian, we're not tied to all this prior baggage. It doesn't, we're dealing with new characters in new places in a different time, and we don't have to worry so much about, does everything that's going on adhere to the canon I know? Because we're kind of coming in, with The Mandalorian, it's been 5 years since anything that we knew within the Skywalker saga. When we talked a little bit about on the Scarif Podcast, Ro, the fact that you got the biker scouts that are sitting there shooting at the can and they can't hit it. It's another level when you consider the fact that the Empire at that point is in a bit of disarray. You're dealing with kind of the dregs of the Empire in terms of the troops that are left. They've already lost 2 full Death Stars worth of their best troops, a Super Star Destroyer worth of their best officers and troops. So whoever is left, quote unquote, as stormtroopers, biker scouts, etc., are not the A class of that particular group. So there's a whole nother layer that, like, the super fan is going to think of. The casual viewer probably not going to look at anything in that depth. But it's just really interesting because, anything fan service related, the casual viewer may not even notice it as being fan service or a callback to anything in the first place. So
Yeah.
I think that I'm going to play a clip here from Charles Westcott, who sent in a voicemail to our call-in line. And if anyone is interested in doing that for future episodes, you can reach us at 201-746-JTAP. So give us a call, let us know your thoughts. But Charles kind of weighed in with his thoughts on fan service, and I'll play that here for you now.
Hey, Rob. My name is Charles Westcott. I'm co-host of Conversations Podcast. I don't know if you've heard of us, but we're a little homegrown little operation. And I saw a question you had today with regards to fan service that you're going to be recording with the Scarif Podcast. And I had a thought about that. In my opinion, fan service used well can certainly increase someone's like for part of a story or even the thread of a story, because it'll bring that person into the story a little bit more, because they make that call out and see, oh, wow, look at that, I figured that out. But if it's used too much, it certainly can derail a story, because you're spending too much time trying to figure out where these call-outs are coming from, and you're sort of hemming and hawing that, oh, wow, here's another one. Here's another direct reference. Or here's another blatant use of an existing trope or an existing character. But the other side of that is that for the casual fan, those types of call-outs or fan service pieces are another way to ingratiate the new viewer or the casual viewer and bring them deeper into the story. So if they make that connection between the story they're watching and an earlier story they made, they're going to think more about, oh, wow, look at that. I just made that connection. That makes me want to see more. And I think sometimes as Star Wars fans, in my opinion, we sort of pay too much attention to details and lose sight of what the entire point of the story is about, is to not only be enjoyable for the people who know the story very intimately, but also try to bring new people into it and make them want to see more and make them have their own personal connections and delve deeper into the universe. So that's my opinion, and hope you enjoy that, and hope to hear my voice on your show, because that'd be kind of cool. Talk to you later. Bye.
So kind of as Charles says, interestingly enough, if you don't have, the first viewing of a film, if you don't recognize something, is it fan service? If you recognize it the second time, was it that obvious in the first place, right? So, for some of us who are familiar with all the Star Wars content and we kind of live it, breathe it, drink it every day, we may catch that on the first viewing. A casual observer may never notice that. Rogue One, the ghost crops up in numerous scenes in that particular movie. Casual viewer is not going to know anything about that ship or the backstory.
Yep.
Someone who's more of a super fan, even for me, I didn't realize how many scenes it was in the first several times I watched that film. So, super pertinent example of something that, quote unquote, could be considered fan service, but very much in keeping with what was going on in that time frame.
So if we can kind of change the direction a little bit, if you want to talk about, like, that was all really good fan service. The Ghost is an excellent example of great fan service. It's not recognizable to most people, but the fans, right? The quote unquote fans are going to see it right away and be like, oh my gosh, that's the Ghost. The episode of Mandalorian that I think I've heard most people say that they kind of were like meh on was the episode when they went back to Tatooine. Because that was a spoonful of fan service from start to finish.
Yeah,
you've got when he lands into the bay. You've got those little droids from episode 1. Yeah, the pit droids. That's fan service. Not bad in my opinion. Not bad fan service. It makes sense that they would be there. And then he walks, and he just so happens. I'm sure. I don't know. Is this the only bar in Mos Eisley, or is that just the? So it's like he goes into the bar from A New Hope. We get that moment where, like, we recognize where Han Solo was sitting when he shot Greedo. Like, that I don't know if that was necessary. Okay, not a problem. We can handle it. It's nice to be back in there again. Seeing it like empty, I guess, was kind of a weird thing for me. I expected it to be a little bit more of a bustling city like it was in A New Hope. But I guess after the fall of the Hutts, some people were kind of explaining to me like, hey, after the Hutts kind of disappeared, Mos Eisley kind of became like a ghost town. There wasn't really any criminal activity going on. I'm like, okay.
Droids.
Yeah, it was mostly droids too.
No droids.
We don't serve their kind here. So, and that could be another example of fan service, right? Because we're both laughing about it. So there's your fan service for the moment with the droids. I thought that was funny. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. That episode was not my favorite for many different reasons. And seeing the Tusken Raiders, I don't know if you consider that fan service, but I kind of had an issue with how they were just like super chill with the Mandalorian. Like, oh, hey, what's up, buddy? How you doing? It's good to see you again. It's like, what? These guys were savages, man. They were like going at people, kidnapping, murdering, torturing, and they're just like, oh yeah, we know Mando. That's that cool guy. We've seen him before. Let's have a quick chat. Let him on his way.
That entire episode for me seemed very like it was a fan film, like literally a fan film that you would find on YouTube.
Yeah, I can see that.
What's crazy about that is that episode was directed by Dave Filoni, and when I think of a person who understands Star Wars and understands canon and understands how to present stuff to fans in a way that's going to be well received, Filoni is at the top of the list. And I felt like that episode was maybe the one time where him doing a live action episode exposed kind of his unfamiliarity with working with actors, because the issue that I had primarily in that episode was some of the performances that were given. And it wasn't necessarily quote unquote a bad story, but it was, if you were going to throw one episode away of season 1, that would have been the one that I would pick. And then to your point, Alex, on Scarif Podcast, the very next episode was Rick Famuyiwa doing the episode where they were kind of doing the prison break from the Republic prisoner ship, and that was amazing. And really kind of started the ramp up to what I thought was an amazing season 1, kind of finale last 2 episodes. So it was surprising that the episode that I liked the least came from Dave Filoni, given that I love most everything else he does within Star Wars. But yes, there was a lot of fan service in that.
Yeah, I think that if anybody has an example of like what is heavy-handed fan service, that would be the episode you would point at. Like, hey, this is a bit much. we get it. You're a Star Wars fan. We're on Tatooine. Yeah. Like, I think I could definitely see if somebody was kind of put off by that episode, like I was. It's almost too much all at once. The fan service, I think, is something that needs to be sprinkled throughout in little tiny bits, not just like that was like a double bowl of ice cream. It's just like way too much. Felt sick afterwards. You're like, oh man, that was too much.
Yeah, that was a 17 scoop Eiffel Tower bowl of fan service. It's funny you mentioned that that was Dave Filoni's episode, and I wonder if that episode would have worked as a cartoon, because it definitely had that feel to it. Everything from the humor of Amy Sedaris.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
From that and the actor's god awful performance, in my opinion, I don't think worked very well. It would have been an interesting view to see that episode as a cartoon, because I think we wouldn't be as harsh on it if it were part of a Rebels episode.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Filoni is the first person who would say that it was a new experience for him working with a live action environment and actually having to deal with the actors, because again, you're dealing with a performance that's coming from a person who's trying to interpret a particular character, as opposed to you being able to just kind of incorporate that into a cartoon or an animation, which is something that he's been incredibly successful with. So all right. So when we talk about The Mandalorian, again, this is another perfect example of the fact that once you kind of step outside of the Skywalker saga, they have a little bit more leeway, I feel like, to deal with these fan service items, to drop them in. That episode aside, they did a lot of great things within The Mandalorian. Certainly Baby Yoda, which was the highlight, or the child, if you prefer, of season 1. That is absolutely something that most people would consider to be fan service, but it worked within the greater arc of that particular storyline.
True.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's
Baby Yoda.
I know. I'm jealous. I bought this for Ro, and I'm like, man, I kind of want this. Maybe I should just keep it.
Show it to
him. Yeah, Mandalorian, and again, like moving forward in Star Wars, if we're talking like beyond the sequel trilogy, going forward into the next trilogy or the next set of movies, or if they go the cinematic Marvel route and they start making just kind of one-off films that loosely connect, and then they kind of do the team up at the end, whatever they decide to do, I believe there is still going to be a healthy serving of fan service in those movies, but being separated so much from the Skywalker saga and all these legacy movies and legacy characters that we know of, it might be a little bit easier to handle. It might be a little less, I don't know, just kind of off-putting for them to do some kind of fan service. Like if a new character somewhere that we don't really know says something along the lines of like, I have a bad feeling about this, or this is where the fun begins, or something like that, it's gonna be like, oh, that's cool. That's a cool moment. It's nice to hear them say that. But I swear to God, if we get another Death Star, I'm done, man.
Right.
It's too many. Like stop blowing up planets.
One of the things that I see a lot of fan service with repetition of lines and stuff are in some of the Star Wars comic books. And I read a few titles, and I think I mentioned to one of you guys in a Twitter conversation we were having, if I hear someone say, you can dispense with the pleasantries, Commander, one more time, and it's not Darth Vader, it's too much. It's too over the top. But there are some titles that really stop doing that and really get into the nitty gritty of the story with great dialogue. I think the lead up comic book to the lead up comic book series to that is really great. No repeated lines, great story arc, really good characters. I'm enjoying that. And sometimes I guess there is such thing as fan service fatigue from that perspective. But there's a line obviously in the sand that is different to each and every person, especially in Star Wars.
Yeah, Ro, you played through the episodes of Vader Immortal, right? So far?
Yes.
Has Vader said any iconic lines or any kind of repeat lines from the original trilogy in that video game?
One or two. But you know what? When it comes to Vader, I'm blind because I
More
really
forgiving.
I love Vader, as you can see behind me. I am definitely more forgiving. You know, standing in front of Vader and him telling you impressive, most impressive. I'm like, yes, thank you. So yeah, no, it's a lot more forgiving.
Yeah,
the ultimate fan service moment to have an iconic character look at you in the eye and say, most impressive. You're like, oh my God.
In Rogue's defense, having played the entire Vader Immortal series, I'm 6'4". I'm not a tiny guy. I've met you guys both in person, so I shouldn't be intimidated by having Vader walk up to me because I should be at least as big as he is, and I'm looking at his chest. So basically, everything else kind of goes out the door. I know that he said some things that were probably callbacks to films. I couldn't tell you a single one of them. But yeah, if you ever get a chance, and I will tell this to all our listeners, if you ever get a chance to play any of the Vader Immortal episodes, jump on it. I know that they've offered it at some Dave & Buster's as one of their VR experiences. I've also done the VR experience at Disney Springs, the Secrets of the Empire, which is like Vader Immortal to the next level, because not only do you have that VR storyline, but you've got like a vest on where you can feel every blaster impact.
Oh, nice.
Oh, wow.
And every room that you walk through physically is exactly what you're seeing in the game. So if you see a wall control and you reach out and trigger
it, there,
you feel it under your hand.
Wow.
So it is incredible.
That's
and
awesome.
There's a great tie-in to that. So with regards to what we were talking about earlier with Rogue One, kind of the interesting thing, and we talked about Tarkin and his character and the kind of the additional character development and character particulars of his character that you get within that series. But if you are a fan of the actual the books and some of the comics that they put out, you get within the current Thrawn trilogy that they had recently released over the past few years, you get a lot more insight into Tarkin's character and the fact that while he was a Grand Moff, he was also very political. And the maneuvering that we see within Rogue One is very much in keeping with what we see in his character in the books. And it's a wonderful thing for us as podcasts that most fans don't have time to keep up with the comics and the books and all of the different media that is out there. So if they want to get more enjoyment out of some of these films, we're a great place to go to kind of get that filled in without having to invest all that time. So we're in a pretty secure position for the future, but it's really it's interesting because what someone might perceive as fan service with a Tarkin appearance in the film, if they are unfamiliar with kind of the backstory in the books, what is actual character development or consistent with that character within a film may be perceived as fan service, even though it's really just furtherance of what that character development was in some of these other media.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that you mentioned other media, because I always often think about all the different story platforms that we have, especially for Star Wars. I don't think Star Wars is unique in that it has so much other ways of telling the story, and from comic books and novels and now games and things like that, besides the cinematic experience of the storytelling for this franchise. It's a very interesting way of telling the story, and it's a monumental task, from a company perspective, because there's a lot to keep track of. Obviously Marvel has done a great job with keeping track of it, with the history of their characters. Granted, they change a few here and there because of the times that we live in. Some of these characters have changed, for whatever reason. But Star Wars is unique, again, just having so many other different ways of telling the story. As a Star Wars fan and someone that loves fan service, it's a great time to be alive, to be a Star Wars fan, because we're getting so much.
I cannot disagree with that. Alex, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, on what?
Yeah. No, I mean, Ro was just basically talking about the fact that with all the various forms of media that kind of further the Star Wars story, it's a great time to be a fan. And, again, kind of to my earlier point about the fact that with most fans not really having the time to invest, I mean, I love Star Wars. I try to read everything that comes out. I can't even keep up with all the comic series that are out there. And I'm supposed to be hosting a podcast where I'm supposedly an authority on these things. It's a great time to be a fan. There's never a lack of material out there, but there's also kind of an underlying factor, which is that there has to be some way to kind of keep all of this in line. I know that with the expanded universe, I mean, we talk about the fact that when Force Awakens came out, they basically wiped the expanded universe and pushed that into Legends. I mentioned it a number of times on our podcast. They're very much at risk of having the same thing happen here if they're not careful with kind of curating all of these various forms of media that they put stories out in today.
Yeah, definitely. It's very difficult to keep up with. And I run another podcast of my own where we talk about movies and films. And, I always have to go and say, okay, I want to make sure I know what I'm talking about. So I'll search YouTube or I'll search the internet or podcasts like yours. And I'll be like, okay, I need to catch up on this subject. And I'll listen to somebody who's an expert on it just so I can kind of get the cliff notes and understand what I'm talking about before I go onto a podcast and record something. So as far as like a content creator, it's fantastic to have all this different information rolling around there and have people like yourself and Ro who are experts in specific things that I can kind of bounce ideas off of and listen to and get feedback on. But it's definitely hard to keep up with nowadays. And I think it might be even hard for the people who are making the stuff, because a lot of the times you'll catch these little moments of like bad continuity where one thing doesn't really quite match up with another, and then they have to go back and like kind of explain that or retcon something or from a certain point of view, a certain subject, you know what I mean, do a classic Obi-Wan. But the thing that I would say is most important about this expanded universe stuff and these novels and books and comics and stuff like that, and even video games too, is that you never want to use this extra material to explain what's happening in the movie. The movie itself should be standalone. Anybody walking in should be able to just pick up right away, understand what's happening, understand the characters, and enjoy the story. Nowadays with these companies, and it's not just Disney, it goes for CBS with Star Trek and all these other companies that have these big franchises on hand. When they want to do that huge multimedia conglomerate, like, oh, we have books and we have novels and we have movies and we have cartoons and this and that, and it's all connected, and you have to watch this obscure episode of this cartoon in order to understand what's happening in this comic, and then this comic is going to feed into this TV show, and then this TV show is going to feed into this movie that we're going to make later. It's a bit too much. It's hard for the casual viewer. It's even hard for the hardcore fans to really get into, because you have to follow every one of these little plot threads to understand something in a story that should be self-sustaining. So I would just caution. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to listen to me, but if anybody's listening to the salty nerd over here, you don't want to overdo it with your expanded universe or with your like Marvel-esque, you have to watch Ant-Man and the Wasp in order to understand Endgame kind of a thing. Like, yeah, I get what they're doing. It is in a business direction. It's very smart. Bro, what are you doing over there?
I'm calling Kevin Feige, letting him know what your message is. There is a fine line though, because you mentioned Star Trek, and I'm in the middle of enjoying the Picard series, and somebody had shared some screenshots of the comic book story that led up to the events of the series of the supernova. Getting back to George Lucas and Star Wars, George Lucas's method of telling a story, as we all know, he builds the worlds, he builds the infrastructure of what is going on in this world, and he throws you in the middle of it without really having to explain like every single detail. But there's certainly a fine art, because I think the sequel trilogy has tried to do that, but has failed in many ways, because I think there's more questions now than before. And I hate to say this, but that, it's, there's certain things in the original trilogy that, were left kind of like with a little question mark. They might have been explained later on. Yeah. But I think nowadays they are really counting on that additional material, of the additional ways of telling the story, to kind of fill in the gaps without having to worry about the quality of the story in the first place. Because I think if the quality of the story in the first place was maybe, I don't know, fine-tuned or tweaked a little bit more, I think that extra material probably would mean a lot more to us, in hindsight.
Yeah, and I got in an argument with somebody on Twitter, of course, about this very subject, about Boba Fett. I was like, they were complaining about Captain Phasma being kind of a waste. We didn't get anything about her character. She died like a punk, whatever. She looked cool, but she had no like real stamina or no staying power. I'm like, everything you just said could be said about Boba Fett. It's like, you know what I mean? Like up until
true
in the 70s and 80s and the 90s, like we knew nothing about Boba Fett. There was some EU material, from what I understand, some books and stuff, and then of course he showed up in the Star Wars Christmas special cartoon. I think that was like the first introduction to him. But like we really didn't know anything about him in the films, and he kind of died with like a slapstick joke with Han being blind and accidentally hitting him in his rocket pack, and it's like, and then they complain about Captain Phasma, and I'm like, yeah, I get what you're saying. She's not as popular now because it hasn't been 20 years of lore and building, and like, oh, Boba Fett was so cool looking. Like it's not the same. We don't live in the same world that we did in the 70s and 80s when he became popular. So it's Star Wars fans are weird, man.
Yeah,
they get hung up
I
on
can
some,
see that.
They get hung up on some weird things. Yeah. It's like, and Phasma could have, who knows, Phasma could have a story written about her. I think there is one book about her.
Yeah, it's called Phasma.
Is it? Oh, okay. She already has a book about her.
She's got a book, yeah.
Yeah, and who knows, she, like the thing that I said was like, it took 20 years for us to learn where Boba Fett came from, and the only reason we know, and I honestly, this might actually serve into our plot about fan service, is like, do we really need to have Boba Fett being the template for the clone army? Like, that felt like that kind of is a fan servicey moment. We're like, oh, everybody loved Boba Fett, so let's have him or his dad be the template for the clone army, and that way we can have like a cool little Boba Fett backstory. Like, that's fan service. That's 100%
totally.
fan service.
I agree. And first of all, we still don't know why this stranger needed a child, as his own. It's kind of a little creepy there.
He wanted to be a single dad, bro.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, that's just an example of interesting fan service that, you could or could not agree with. I know a lot of people love the prequels these days. Ro, you're one of them. I grew up in a time where it was kind of the cool thing to kind of poop on the prequels. So that's just kind of how my mentality is. But having Boba Fett be a main part of that was 20 years later. We didn't know anything about him in the original trilogy. So when you can kind of compare that to the Captain Phasma, where we don't really have a lot of information on, looks really cool, has maybe a couple cool backstories. I understand her armor was made out of a cruiser from Naboo. I think it was Emperor Palpatine's cruiser, which I think that's kind of cool.
That's very cool.
So I mean, there's a lot of cool elements to Phasma, and her being a fan service moment or a fan service character, kind of harkening back to trying to be the next Boba Fett. Like,
sure,
you can take it or leave it. Some people don't like it. I don't think it's a problem, but it's definitely an example of fan service.
That comment triggered something for me that you had talked about earlier, and that was a thought that had popped into my head and then kind of escaped me. But when we were talking about, the First Order armor, and then the fact that the Sith Trooper was basically just kind of like a red version of that, to me, that all ties into the fact that the Praetorian Guard had worn that red armor, and that actually was one of the materials that was resistant to glancing blaster bolts and glancing lightsaber attacks. It was one of the materials that was actually in some ways resistant to lightsabers. And you actually see within The Rise of Skywalker, they charge through the halls of the Star Destroyer, of Kylo Ren's Star Destroyer, and they're taking out the stormtroopers right and left, shooting them in the upper chest, and they just fall into the ground. When they're charging across the hull plates of the Star Destroyer that's kind of rising into atmosphere and fighting against the Sith troopers, they very deliberately show a Sith trooper take a shot in pretty much the same spot, and it just kind of glances off and he continues fighting. So to me, that red armor was actually, had some of those same properties as the Praetorian Guard armor, in the sense that it was resistant to blaster bolts and lightsabers. And that's something that you wouldn't expect a typical fan to know. You kind of have to be a little bit more into the lore, but it goes very much to your point about the fact that I do think that they're very much at risk of creating a situation where they're not telling the full story in the film, that you do have to have some understanding of some of this expanded material. And I do think that that is a negative in terms of storytelling within the Star Wars universe. What's interesting is that now we are experiencing this Disney Plus streaming service where, for less than the cost of potentially creating a film, you can do a 8 or 10 episode arc on that streaming service, and you have more ground to actually flesh out the story. And it just kind of makes me wonder if the long-term goal is going to be, we talk about the movement online about, Solo 2. I can far easier see that being a Disney Plus streaming series as opposed to a film in the theater.
I agree. I would love to see Solo 2 as part of a series. And, one of the aspects of that film is, getting back to our fan service talk, there were definitely some callbacks there that really harkened back to A New Hope. A lot of elements that I really enjoyed with the story, and something that I hope that gets kind of revisited if a sequel to Solo gets started, whether in film form or Disney Plus. I think it will be an interesting time going forward, especially with Disney Plus, because it is yet another way to tell a Star Wars story. And never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined that we would get, Star Wars series like we are getting now. So it's going to be, if you don't like fan service now, then hold on to your hats, brother, because it's coming.
Yeah, and it's a different time too, because if you look back at the original trilogy, kind of going back to the whole Boba Fett thing, also the Emperor, we never got any kind of backstory of the Emperor. We don't know how he became Emperor. He was the big bad. He was the man in charge. And I think what you guys were talking about with George kind of just dropping us in the middle of a situation and letting us take off and go for it, like, that worked back then because it was the original trilogy. It was the first story that they were telling. Now that we've lived in this universe for 40 years, much harder to kind of drop people in the middle of a situation without answering a ton of questions, without explaining to them why this person is doing that or why this person is in charge or who's involved, unless, like Rob, like you said, it's something like The Mandalorian where it's kind of separated from the overarching story and kind of away from the characters that we know, which I think was one of the problems with Snoke. I know Rian Johnson kind of defended his movie by saying, like, I can kill Snoke if I want to. They killed the Emperor and we didn't know anything about him. And I'm like, yeah, but you can't do that anymore. Like, George could do it, but it's kind of hard to do that now because we lived in this universe. So there's a lot of fan service involved in that, where, like, it might be hard for some directors to do because they feel like they shouldn't have to, but in a way you do have to kind of service the fandom and acknowledge the fact that they are steeped into this world and they expect answers to these kind of like questions that people normally wouldn't ask, I guess. But we do now. And there's so many Star Wars fans out there that you can't ignore that demographic. It's not just a few nerds online talking about it like us three. Sure. It's an entire culture out there now. A lot of people, a lot of nerds online too. Right. So it's it's something that you have to consider as a story maker and as a director when you're making these movies that are in this universe, in this sandbox. You kind of have to play by the rules now.
Yeah, it's definitely harder to surprise you when it comes to this, and I think that's one of the reasons that I'm kind of happy now that Rise of Skywalker Episode 9 is done. We get to explore a new sandbox, if you will, Alex. in this in this Star Wars universe. We'll always have great moments from the original trilogy and some of the other Star Wars films that we have enjoyed throughout the years. But I'm looking forward to see what they come up with new Star Wars, new characters, and I'm excited.
Yeah, and just along the lines of what Alex was talking about, I know that when we did the last the fireside chat with Scarif out here online, and it's out there on his YouTube channel if you want to go check it out. But Semper Fi Danny had basically been talking about the fact that one of the issues with the Reylo approach to things was that it was so heavily hinted at that there was some sort of connection that went beyond just a dyad in the Force within The Last Jedi, and it was kind of a bait and switch situation within The Last Skywalker. So to your point, Alex, I mean, it is something where you have to be very careful about that, and you're going to potentially rile the fan base if you seem to promise them something and then yank that rug out from under their feet. So certainly, the interesting thing about this is what is going to be the future of Star Wars. We know there's still going to be some Star Wars in the cinema. It's clear that they're going to be doing a lot of Star Wars within the streaming service that Disney Plus is offering, within the comics, within the books, within who knows what else, some of the audiobooks that have been done with Dooku Jedi Lost. So there's all kinds of media that this is coming out in, and I do agree that is just going to open the door for more claims of fan service. But I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I'm on board with both of you in the sense that in many cases, if it's in service to the story, fan service is a good thing. So, Alex, I know that earlier you were very humble in the sense that you did not refer to your podcast. So for any of our listeners, that is the Salty Nerd Podcast. Ro is a longtime supporter of the Salty Nerd, and I would definitely recommend that to anyone who is interested in pop culture. Overall, you guys deal with more than just Star Wars. You deal with Marvel and any number of other topics. So I would certainly encourage, most of our listeners, they may be Star Wars fans, but certainly they're going to be interested in other topics outside of Star Wars. And you guys are a great opportunity to go catch up on the latest and greatest in that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Thanks, Rob. I run the Salty Nerd Podcast. It's just a group of friends. We sit down and chat about the week's pop culture news, TV shows that are more lean towards the nerd culture. We don't really do the dramas and stuff like that, but we do, like Stephen King has got that new show on HBO, The Outsider. We talk about that. Avenue 5 is a story about people in space, so we talk about that. But we do definitely cover all the comic book movies, Marvel, and Star Wars news, and anything else that really has to do with nerd culture. We just sit down and have a chat, and it's a lot of fun. There's a little bit of salt. We definitely criticize things that we don't like, and we're not afraid to tell people what we think is good and what we think is not good. So we just have a lot of fun with it. It's just a couple of people sitting down and having a good time. We hang out at 8:00 in the morning on a Wednesday afternoon, and we chat about movies and stuff. And it's a nice dynamic. We're pretty new. We've only got about 15 episodes in as far as this main group that I'm working with right now of co-hosts, and they're great people, and we have a ton of fun listening or talking about it. So hopefully that comes across. Ro, you can kind of speak to what it feels like to be a listener of that group dynamic that we have. I'm in the middle of it, so it's hard for me to know if it's funny or not, but I love the guys that I talk to, and I'm hoping that comes across for the listeners as well.
Sorry, Rob, we're taking over your podcast here, but the Salty Nerd Podcast, you guys have a great team that talk everything geek and nerd, the two Matts and your new new contributor, Jude. Yeah, you guys are fantastic. I listened to the podcast, and it's actually one of the first podcasts that I really got into. And I remember thinking, I'm like, oh wow, this guy is really cool. He gets right to the meat of things. He doesn't talk about what he had for breakfast for the first 28 minutes, and then he starts at his. So it's an element of podcast that I enjoy. And then listening to Salty Nerd Podcast and all you guys, I was telling you guys earlier on our show that starting that last episode, you guys talked about, I was grinning ear to ear because it definitely feels like, you're hanging out with your buddies at a bar, drinking and talking film. So it's very, laid back. It's very, you definitely get an education with Kadish there.
Yeah.
And it's a really fun podcast to listen to. I'd highly recommend it.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely don't stop there, Ro. I mean, you've got your Scarif podcast. I've been a fan of you guys since you started when it was just you and Brad, and then you guys brought Alex on board as Brad is a member of the military and currently in active service, so he kind of gets deployed and isn't always able to make the podcast. But I would definitely recommend any of our listeners certainly listen to the Salty Nerd podcast and definitely check out the Scarif podcast. We do a lot of work with them. We did ScarifCon 2019 in Chicago back in November. That's available on the Scarif podcast channel. But you guys definitely take a look at things, certainly from a more adult perspective. You're not afraid to give your thoughts about what's going on in the Star Wars world. Which I think for a lot of us who have been longtime fans is really the way that we like to address it. We should be able to talk about all these things. You guys are always very good about, listening to people from all viewpoints and having a rational, reasonable discussion without it becoming, something where everyone's getting their feathers ruffled. And I definitely respect that. That is a rare talent to have in this day and age.
The Switzerland of Star Wars podcasts, the Scarif Scuttlebutt.
Right. Yeah. Somebody had mentioned that. It's funny. I'm very humbled, and I'm very lucky to have, a co-host like Alex and Brad. We started back in April. Rob, you'll attest to this as well. I mean, we've made such a great community. We got folks like Lauren from the Galactic podcast. We got Charlie Skywalker. We got Pete Fletzer, Mike. There's a lot of us that are doing this, and there's a lot of us that support each other. And I have been humbled at all the support and from all across our Star Wars fan community and podcast community, #pod people. So, it's been a great ride. We continue to make friends and grow the podcast, especially when we do collaborations like this with you, Rob, and with some of our other pod friends. And, we just want to talk Star Wars, have a good time, and just having fun.
Yeah. Riffing on a point that was made earlier in the podcast, right? It was the Obi-Wan Kenobi, a great many things done greatly on our point of view, and that is certainly the case within the Star Wars community. And just because I'm coming from a particular viewpoint and I feel a particular way about certain things doesn't mean we can't sit down and have a rational conversation. I can't count the number of times that in this collaboration we've had between Jedi Temple Archives and Scarif Podcast that someone's brought up a point that has made me think a different way about something that maybe I had a preconception about. I know I've brought up points that, I can picture the look on Alex's face where he'll be like, and so the fact that people are willing to at least consider another viewpoint and approach it from that and kind of maybe rethink something they held to be fact, is what this is supposed to be about. We're supposed to be kind of enriching each other's experience, and I very much feel like that's been the case in our collaborations in the past.
That's what drew me to podcasts when I first started listening to I think Joe Rogan's podcast, where he would have these controversial figures on as interviewing and guests, and he was like, it's much easier to be negative when you have just quick snippets and sound bites, but when you sit down and you have a conversation with somebody for an hour or 2 hours or something like that, you can get this much more nuanced idea of what somebody's opinion is. And I think that helps in the current state of Star Wars fandom. I think it's important for us pod people to be out here having full conversations about a subject that might, if you look on Twitter, it looks like the fandom is at war, and if they go to Celebration, they're going to try and kill each other with fake lightsabers. It's like, that's like a whole different world online. But if you come onto here and you have a conversation with somebody, it's a totally different feeling. So I, for one, am a big fan of podcasting, and I'm glad to see that Ro and Rob you guys are heading off the Star Wars fandom, as far as I'm concerned, in a new direction, as opposed to some of these old school Star Wars podcasts who might be kind of set in their ways and might be a bit more controversial. I really like to support the people who are, hey, let's have a conversation about this and let's see if we can come to a result that is at least acceptable to most people, or talk about a subject that we might not agree on, but it's okay if we don't agree on. We don't have to have some kind of a crazy blood feud on Twitter about it. So I definitely appreciate the work that you guys are doing. And that's one of the reasons why I came on to work with Ro on Scarif Scuttlebutt, was I was like, I like what you're doing. I like the takes that you had with Brad. And of course, the production quality is just on point, man. I'm still impressed by that.
Absolutely. Every episode, Ro puts a lot of time and effort into the Scarif podcast. Definitely check them out. Guys, thank you so much for coming on. I don't want to take up too much more of your evening. I think we had a great discussion across the 2 episodes that we had. I don't think it's a topic that we're ever going to solve, no matter how many episodes we do on it. But, again, having these conversations is what makes people think. And I think that's really the most important thing in terms of the Star Wars fandom in this day and age.
Thank you very much, Rob, for having us. A wonderful collaborator as always. And until next time, we're also gearing up to do another collaboration with the folks at Coruscant Radio Underground. We're going to be talking about our favorite Star Wars novels, and anything from Thrawn to some of the recent books, Kevin Scott and Claudia Gray, Lost Stars. And we're going to be taking a special look at what almost became the sequel to Star Wars, Alan Dean Foster's Splinter of a Mind's Eye. And that should be a very interesting discussion. Andrew reads a lot. I think he's going to be able to give us some great insight into all of our favorite novels. I haven't read a whole bunch of them, but the ones that I've read, I've really enjoyed. I think my favorite one is Lost Stars, but Claudia Gray. Albeit at a young adult's novel. Hey, I'm a young adult. What the hell, man? But it's a really great, well-written story. And she's probably one of my favorite Star Wars writers at this moment. So we'll be having a discussion at the end of the month with those folks.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend that particular book to anyone who's a fan. It is considered current canon. And the interesting thing about that is it deals with 2 young people that it ties in with Grand Moff Tarkin relatively early in the book, but they kind of end up along different paths after going through the Imperial Academy, and one ends up aligning with the Rebel Alliance, and the other one is aligned with the Galactic Empire. And it's very interesting to kind of get that dynamic. It's very much a blue and a gray type of storyline where you've eventually got not in this case brothers fighting against each other, but certainly 2 young people that have a connection based on their shared experience, but end up along different paths. So really, really cool, pertinent story. But yeah, thank you guys both for coming on. We're going to go ahead and wrap the episode, and we look forward to hearing more from you guys next week. So thank you so much, and may the Force be with you.